welcome everyone. I'm very excited that many are joining us. I still see that many are joining us as we speak, but I will kick it off here. So my name is Gustav Tungren. I'm the Managing Director of the Earth System Governance Project, and on behalf of our research network, I would like to welcome you all and introduce you to today's ESG speaker series titled Geopolitical Turmoil and Earth System Governance. And for those that are not familiar with the ESG project, we are one of the largest global social science networks in the area of governance and environmental global environmental change. The ESG network comprises 70 research centers across all continents. We have over 450 research fellows from all over the world, various working groups, task forces, as well as 4 flagship publication series, 1 element with Cambridge, 2 book series, Cambridge and MIT respectively, as well as the Earth System Governance Journal. And of course, in October this year, we host our annual conference in Toronto. And the aim of this ESG speaker series is to provide a platform to explore, discuss, and engage with contemporary debates emerged from scholars affiliated with the Earth System Governance Project. And as a community, the vision of our community is expressed in the most recent Science and Implementation Plan of 2018. It is to understand, imagine, and help realize just and sustainable futures by stimulating a pluralistic, vibrant, and relevant research community. And of course, in light of the latest IPCC report and geopolitical events over the last months, we are reminded how important this vision of the future is, and likewise the challenges in which the context in which the future is shaped, as well as global environmental governance is conducted. And for that reason, we are here today for this ESG speaker series. And today's session will be chaired by Dr. Agni Kalfagianni, who's a co-chair of the Earth System Governance Scientific Steering Committee, and likewise associate professor at Utrecht University. She will introduce the speakers as well as who are the speakers of this roundtable session. But before I hand over, I will just go through a few house rules. So I will turn on the housekeeping slide. And just so you all know, this is a Teams webinar. And currently only panelists, chairs, and moderators, videos and audios are enabled. Chat functions is enabled, and any questions can be posted in chat. And of course, this will be moderated for any offensive or inappropriate language as well. This is a roundtable discussion, but after the roundtable discussion, we welcome the audience to address any questions to the panel that you may have. And in order to ask a question, you can put this in the chat. And if you want to direct it to a specific speaker, we do ask you to put their name ahead of the question you pose. And then we hopefully will be able to address all the questions coming through. And after this webinar, we will have a small little informal get-together in this channel. We will invite all attendees to be visible on screen, and if you want to stay around and just have a chat. With this said, I hand over to Agni Kalfagianni. Agni, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Gustav. I'm greatly honored to chair this webinar today on a really important and really timely topic, which was unfortunately inspired by very tragic circumstances, as you are all aware of, the war in Ukraine, and made us really think in the Earth System Governance community. The role of geopolitics is very central, and how we can really engage as scholars who are interested in what happens around us in this type of discussions, like how we can understand the relation between environmental governance and energy governance with geopolitics. So we are in a geopolitical turmoil, and this challenges many things right now. Challenges the multilateral context in which We wish global environmental governance to shape solutions and realize sustainability transformations. We observe currently transformations, but of a very violent and abrupt nature, and the consequences are manifold, from global diplomacy to energy security, to food security, but also more broadly to the ability of the international community to address collectively the very urgent sustainability challenges that we are facing. So this kind of questions and this kind of repercussions are going to be addressed by our distinguished speakers today, and I would like to very briefly introduce them to you before I give them the floor. So we have today with us Professor Simon Dalby, who is Professor of Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, where he teaches in the Balsillie School of International Affairs and is also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and is a long-standing scholar on questions of geopolitics. Next, we have Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram, who is a research fellow at the Center Mark Bloch and guest researcher at Freie Universität Berlin, as well as an assistant professor at Manipal Academy of Higher Education in Karnataka, India. And Dr. Marie-Claire Brisbois, who is a senior lecturer in energy policy at SPRU and co-director of the Sussex Energy Group at Sussex University. So I will give the floor to each one of the speakers, and after everyone speaks, I will open the floor to questions from the audience. So with that, I would like to invite Simon to share his screen with us.
Okay, I'm not sure if you can see that or not.
We can see that, Simon, but it's not in full.
Okay, just a moment. There we go. How's that?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Well, then, without further ado, let me simply get started with a discussion that is certainly timely, and I would like to simply thank you all for the invitation to contribute to this discussion. Clearly, the questions of geopolitics matter greatly in the current context with the Ukraine war being very much on our minds. Geopolitics has traditionally been understood about territory, about controlling space, and insofar as there is an iconic image of geopolitics from history, it is probably the Berlin Wall, which dominated the division of Europe for a few decades. This is an image that is captured on the front cover of John Agnew's Geopolitics book, which describes geopolitics in terms of rivalries amongst great powers. It describes the world as being understood as a single entity which can be divided, argued, and fought over. If the image is a little fuzzy, that suits my purpose very well, simply because that image is beginning to fade. And it's also fuzzy because, of course, geopolitics is about more than just the arguments about territory, the control of particular spaces, and the use of artifacts such as walls to restrict movement and to assert political control or formal notions of sovereignty over particular parts of that Earth's surface. If one thinks about geopolitics a little more comprehensively, as Agnew does in some of his other work, and as Jaris Grove has done in his discussion of war, geopolitics, and the end of the world in his book Savage Ecology a couple of years ago, Grove reminds us that geopolitics isn't just about borders and spatial control. It's also about asserting a particular mode of life. It's about exerting control in Agnew's terms, but it's about more than that. It's about what Agnew would call hegemony in terms of the dominance of substantial parts of the world system. The idea here is that particular modes of life are involved in the processes of dominance, controlling spaces, arguing over the control of space, who owns and controls a particular chunk of territory, which is what we tragically see playing out in various parts of the Ukraine as we speak, is what geopolitics has traditionally been about. But of course, it's about, as the image here of blazing fires, destroyed vehicles and a lost animal suggest, it's about ecological dimensions too, because of course, if you are controlling spaces, you're using technology and in some cases directly firepower to directly control and indirectly, of course, ecologically change things in the process. Reflecting on what to say today, I was reminded that we are very close to a landmark moment that links geopolitics and ecology, because it was June this year will be the 50th anniversary of the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm, which really pulled together for the first time people from various states, government representatives and scientists, to explicitly deal with the environment as an object of governance, to think about the environment as the entity that needed to be governed in some ways or other. Prior to that, there was lots of talk about resources and famines and technologies and all sorts of other things. But actually synthesizing this as a focus on this one category of environment, we are coming up to the 50th anniversary of this. And it's worth stopping and reflecting in terms of Earth system governance, what it is that we have learned, what we have not learned, what it is that we perhaps need to learn, and to reflect on governance successes and, for that matter, failures over that 50-year period. It is also crucial to remember that the declaration that comes from the Conference on the Human Environment back in 1972, the very last item on that declaration explicitly demanded the elimination of nuclear weapons and all weapons of mass destruction, simply because they were understood as too dangerous. It's also worth reflecting the geopolitical turmoil of those moments too, because of course quite a lot of delegates didn't come to the conference, or at least heads of government didn't, because there was a big argument about whether East Germany should be given delegate status or not. And the conference was boycotted, at least in part, by the Warsaw Pact states, in part in the dispute over who it was that could actually represent which chunk of the world's territory. And I think that in that sense, it's worth remembering that geopolitical turmoil, in that sense at least, isn't new, and it isn't unrelated to discussions about the global environment. And so in that sense, the context we're looking at now in the Ukraine is at least in some ways reminiscent of the earlier arguments about nuclear weapons and geopolitical representations in the conference. It's also worth pointing out that back in 1972, the whole understanding of the world as a single entity that could be known and, yes, viewed from space, courtesy of Apollo astronauts taking extraordinary photographs, that this was a novel cultural phenomena to a very substantial extent. Now, yes, we'd all had globes for a long time, but to actually see a photograph of the world did change the perspective somewhat. And it is also quite fascinating to go back and read Only One Earth, not least that extraordinary statement in the middle, where Barbara Ward and René Dubos reflect on the fact that if the world continues to buy automobiles that buy, well, more or less now, the world will be well on track to be indescribably hot. The point here is that we have actually done a whole lot of things that Barbara Ward and René Dubos in their informal report to the conference warned us against, not least the extraordinary expansion of internal combustion engine powered private automobiles, which are a key part of why we are now facing a problem with Earth governance. It is also worth remembering that the one visiting Prime Minister, head of state, that was in Stockholm, in addition to the Swedish Prime Minister, was Indira Gandhi. And her famous speech there where she talked about poverty as the worst form of pollution, and warned of a world in which northern states would try to use environment to reduce the possibilities for development in what we would now, but not back then, but now would call the global south. And indeed, much of the climate justice discussion that we are now all familiar with in terms of climate dates from the speech that Indira Gandhi made back in Stockholm. We do need to remember that this was the era of new economic orders. It was a discussion of how the world would be shaped because decolonization of the European empires was more or less done by 1972. And that was the geopolitical turmoil of that period. And it's worth reflecting on the fact that these things are not new, although they have manifested themselves in tragically somewhat different forms in the last few weeks in the Ukraine. What is also clear is that we now understand far better than Barbara Ward and René Dugard did just how fundamental the human fingerprint is on how the Earth system actually functions. We now talk about this in terms of the Anthropocene, a word that was not in the discussion in 1972, obviously. But it is also interesting to look at what Lewis and Maslin in particular have to say about the world as it is in their book now a few years back. But compare that with Only One Earth, because the tentative indications of things that we should worry about that are in Only One Earth really have come to fruition, all of which suggests that we have failed as social scientists, politicians, geopoliticians, to deal with the geographical context in which we all live. And we need to do a lot better in coming decades if we are going to be much more sensitive with where those fingerprints in the Earth system actually lie. One of the major issues that has been discussed in terms of linking environment and geopolitics of late has, of course, been the debate about climate security, the debate about whether, in fact, climate change will cause yet more geopolitical turmoil. The most obvious case is the discussion about Syria and the debate about whether climate caused drought, which caused conflict in Syria, with all the damage to infrastructure and all the death and destruction involved there. Much of the argument, of course, has dismissed the simple determinist arguments about this. Clearly, there was a drought in Syria, but as various studies have suggested, the contribution that drought actually had to causing the civil war was fairly small. What was probably more significant was maldevelopment, to use an old term in this debate. And clearly conflict has caused all sorts of environmental damage. But nonetheless, in terms of climate actually causing conflict, the suggestion is that this is a minor cause, which may be good news. On the other hand, this implicit geography of violence in the global south, of violence as just the way things are going to be, haunts a lot of this discussion. And indeed, Harold Veltzer, his book a decade ago, was warning us about the fact that we would simply live in a world, if we weren't very careful, where we would assume climate disasters were going to cause conflicts. This would simply become the taken for granted geography. And this is, of course, particularly worrisome to people like Sanjay Chaturvedi, to make the Indian connection again, who's currently working in Delhi. The connection, of course, is with Indira Gandhi. And what Sanjay Chaturvedi and Tim Doyle are saying in this book some years ago is much of the climate discussion actually dismisses the global south as simply having to suffer because there's not much that they can actually do about it, both because they're relatively economically undeveloped, but also simply because they are without military options. They are simply in a situation where, in terms of climate and warfare, they don't have military options. They simply have to take whatever it is that the rich and powerful decide to do and suffer the consequences, even though they're not responsible for causing so much of the current geopolitical turmoil. This is the world we live in. This is the world that is made by fossil fuels. It is the world that is made by, as I like to say, firepower, which is loose in the world. And we really do need to stop and rethink environmental security in terms of getting past a world in which both fossil fuels and military power determine the geopolitics of the present. I like to think of this as a rising sun rather than a detonation behind the image of a military person who, of course, also could be a colonial surveyor with some kind of surveying equipment. This seems to me to capture how we need to view the world differently, how we need to move past oil wells and past fossil fuels and past military control as a mode of governance if we wish to have a sustainable future for our planet. And full disclosure, this is the cover image on my shortly to be released book on rethinking environmental security, which attempts to tease out the intersection between these various themes. Because we do live in a world that the Stockholm International Peace Research folks have defined in terms of Anthropocene insecurities. And it is worth reflecting on that 50 years back to the Conference on the Human Environment and thinking seriously about how it is that we move forward to make a world that does not rely on the use of firepower. Can we live in a world where we can actively shape a geopolitics of energy transformation, as ARENA has actually suggested in their Global Commission on Geopolitics a couple of years back? This is clearly the task for the Earth System Governance folks, and that includes all of us here. Can we build back better after the disruptions caused by fossil fuels, by the disruptions caused by the use of the second form of firepower in terms of military firepower in the Ukraine and elsewhere in the world these days, not forgetting Tigray, the Yemen, various other places where violence continues? Can we actually think about geopolitics as expanding the control of a much more sustainable mode of life, to go back to Jarvis Grove's formulation? Because it seems to me that this is the imagination that is crucial to the Earth System Governance system. We have to stop and think about how to build that better world in which there is much less violence, in which ecological flourishing is taken as that which has to be secured, and to reimagine our urban life, because we are now a majority urban species, in terms of a much more integrated connection between life that is human and life that is not human. And it seems to me that imagining a world and asserting this form of life in numerous contexts has to be the priority for Earth System Governance as we work to imagine a world in which firepower in both its forms, civilian in terms of use of fossil fuels and military in terms of explosives and projectiles, is no longer the dominant mode of life that we think about when we reflect on the term geopolitics. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Simon. This was really inspiring, very rich historical context as well as future-oriented. Fantastic. Thank you very much for kicking off in such a great mood. I will pass it immediately to our next speaker, and in the end, as I said, we will have time for questions. So, Dhanasree, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Agni. Let me just, so I'm just trying to share my slide here. I hope it's visible.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me in this panel discussion. And it's always difficult to follow after Professor Dalby, who spoke about the historical context to geopolitics and also geopolitics and the Anthropocene, and also what it means for the future. So what I'm going to do is to kind of talk about region, the Hindu Kush Himalaya region and the Indian Ocean region. I'm just choosing these two regions just to talk about how these issues are interconnected with each other, how Anthropocene, environmental security, the political, social, cultural, economic geographies are so interconnected with each other in these contexts. So although the world is currently mostly invested in talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but there is a lot more going on in the rest of the world. There are conflicts. There is still conventional war that has happened in other parts of the world, and it's also important to reflect on some of these conflicts and wars in borderlands and maritime spaces where these issues are sort of interacting with each other to create Anthropocene insecurities, as Simon also mentioned. So environmental geopolitics, in that sense, what does it really reflect upon? And Shannon O'Leary's book actually talks about how particular aspects of the non-human environment, that is mineral resources, weather patterns, arable land, ecosystem services, and more, how are they understood, represented, and portrayed in terms of spatial aspects of risk or security. So very often we tend to look at them from a very traditional point of view, from traditional security perspective, from military perspective. But as Professor Dalby also mentioned, we need to look at it from a much broader perspective because of the interconnected nature of issues in terms of politics, the socio-cultural dynamics, the economic geographies, because the spatial dimensions of human environmental relationships are much more complex than the traditional notions of security as we have studied in the past. So which is why geopolitics is kind of also reinvented and also reimagined in that sense. We are also talking about imagined geographies as we talk about war zones or conflicts. And at one point of time we thought conventional war was something of the past, and now Europe sees a revival of the traditional sort of geopolitical concerns as we are talking about nuclear weapons and territorial concerns and all of that. So as I mentioned, I would be taking two spaces. One is the continental kind of space as associated with the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, which obviously, I mean, this is something that everybody knows about. It's one of the most biodiverse regions of the world. This is where most of the rivers of South Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia flow from. This is a region where almost 240 million people depend directly on this region for their lives and livelihoods. At the same time, this is also a region where there are high levels of poverty. It's one of the most climate vulnerable regions as well, and you have a most disaster prone region as well. So in terms of numbers, this region is like a kind of a microcosm of the entire world, because this is something that is critical to how environmental security can be perceived in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. So that was just one picture that shows one side of the story, and then this image here shows the other side of the story of the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. This is also one of the most militarized regions in the world, where you have conventional conflicts that are still ongoing between India and Pakistan, India and China. And there are still border conflicts between various other countries which are not yet resolved. So in that sense, what I want to also talk about is the importance of borderlands, and something that has been missed out when we talk about Earth system governance, and especially when we talk about conflict zones or militarized borderlands, because these are spaces which are militarized, not just spatially, where you have large numbers of military personnel who are deployed there with large amount of equipment and arms and ammunition, but ideologically as well, because these areas are dominated by the military, even in terms of provision of governance in the borderlands. This is also sort of an impact of geopolitics with the kind of border conflicts that are ongoing. As I mentioned, this is something of a post-colonial phenomenon as well, because the India-Pakistan border dispute is something that is a perpetual one, which has no solution at all, and even in the future there doesn't seem to be a solution that can provide that can offer peace between the two countries. And how does this really affect sustainable development in the region, in the borderlands, is very critical as well, because the more we focus on these issues of like traditional sort of geopolitics and military conflicts and militarizing the borderlands to provide security, as we call it, the more we are also endangering the Anthropocene, the ecological and social systems that are prevalent in these regions. Because we are also talking about military organizations and the requirement for these organizations to be present in order to maintain territorial integrity. And on the other hand, as I showed in the previous slide, there are issues and transnational environmental issues that transcend political boundaries and that require collaborative efforts, but there is kind of, there is a lack of collaborative or regional approach to most of the environmental issues in the region, considering these kind of geopolitical realities. And there is also the fact that many of the issues of environmental governance or disaster governance, for instance, is sort of still governed or is controlled by the military, where the military tends to play a much bigger role even in the human environment interactions. When we talk about very remote regions or difficult terrain, because Himalayas are also very difficult terrain in that sense. It's also a region where the military tends to play a much bigger role. From a military perspective, Siachen Glacier it's one of the world's highest battle. It is the world's highest battleground, where Indian and Pakistani soldiers are deployed on both sides of the border. Increasingly, Siachen Glacier is also receding really fast, which is also making the militaries to rethink their deployment procedures, thinking about equipment, what equipment to use, where do they deploy themselves. There are also ice avalanches and snow avalanches in which many soldiers have been killed. And very importantly, Siachen Glacier is also a glacier that feeds into the Indus Basin. And that is something that is obviously not talked about as much as well. And this is the river that is the lifeline of Pakistan. It is also something. It is also a river basin that is shared between India and Pakistan. So the military presence in the region obviously endangers the glacier and also the environmental and ecological conditions of the rivers that are dependent on the glacier itself. The other border, on the eastern part, you have India-China border dispute, where again, recently we've had clashes in the Galwan Valley between Indian and Chinese soldiers. Of course, this was brought under control after a point, but the border dispute hasn't been resolved, and the kind of tensions that exist between the two countries is at an all-time high as far as geopolitical tensions are concerned. And in fact, there were reports of how Chinese bulldozers tried to disturb the Galwan River flow, which is also, a river that also feeds into Shyok River, which is part of the Indus Basin as well. More than that, I think what is also important to discuss here is that these are border lands where you have people living who practice agriculture, who practice livestock, who are into the livestock sector as well. And these are communities which are heavily affected by climate and environmental change, which does not get discussed as much because of these geopolitical kind of realities that exist in the region. So despite the Galwan Valley clashes that happened between India and China, the environment ministers of all the countries met virtually, of course, because of the COVID pandemic. And it happened in 2020 and 21 as well, where discussions continued under EC mode, which is an intergovernmental organization involving the countries that you can see over here in the flags of the countries are in the slide. So these are the member countries which met and discussed about climate change. But the reality, again, is the fact that there is very little cooperation, which is transboundary in nature. There is still very little data about what's going on in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. It's such a huge region that transcends political boundaries and ecological boundaries. And and has a lot of and as I mentioned, it's highly vulnerable to climate change. The kind of variations that are being seen in the glaciers, the kind of outbursts of glacial lakes are being seen, or the kind of landslides, or the kind of rising temperatures in the region. All these issues require transboundary cooperation, but of course the kind of geopolitical realities that persist in the region also hinder cooperation between the countries. The other space, I'm just going to shift to maritime space and also oceans. And what do oceans represent in geopolitics, right? So I'm just showing this slide here to show the Kiribati, which is again it's in the Pacific region, and it's one of the most again, it's an island country that is highly vulnerable to sea level rise and other effects of climate change. What are the solutions being offered to Kiribati, right? So as we talk about territory, right? So how do we redefine territory in an age where climate crisis worsens? And one of the ways in which Kiribati wants to, help its people or populations adapt to climate change is by building, say, islands or something like that. And who is offering that assistance to Kiribati? It's China that is, willing to provide that island building strategy and, trying to help these islands adapt to climate change by, say, shifting populations to artificial islands constructed by the Chinese, which is something that the Chinese have also done in the South China Sea, for instance. On the other hand, as you can see in countries like Bangladesh, where land is slowly being lost to the sea. There is already Sundarbans region, which is shared by India and Bangladesh. You can, the picture on the right hand side, you can see that how the Sundarban region is slowly being lost to the sea, and people are migrating in huge numbers into cities of Bangladesh, as well as to other countries in the neighboring region as well. On the left-hand side, you can also see Cox's Bazar, where you have Rohingya refugees who are housed in big numbers. Again, Cox's Bazar is equally vulnerable to different kinds of environmental change, including deforestation, floods, sea level rise, cyclones, and other forms of changes. So the territorial loss and how is it seen in geopolitics in terms of the kind of the humanitarian crisis that we are looking at, in terms of mobility patterns, and in terms of other crises, in terms of livelihoods, insecurity, and issues like that. And in fact, over here, you can see how the Bay of Bengal region, how maritime space is kind of divided, right? So you have exclusive economic zones all over, which is all divided between countries. And at the same time, you have fishermen who are being banned to going out into the sea and fish because of the depleting fish stocks in the Bay of Bengal region. And again, this has a lot to do with different kinds of changes because of the warming oceans, because of illegal and overfishing in the region, including by external players. All these factors are adding to a much bigger crisis in the region. So climate change obviously is amplifying the threat of fishery conflict. This is just one example of East China Sea, but even in the Indian Ocean region, there are conflicts between Myanmar and Bangladesh over fisheries. There is conflict between India and Sri Lanka, for instance, over fisheries and fishermen crossing these boundaries and fishing in the others' waters, which are constantly becoming a huge problem. Just to kind of sum up what is happening, there is geopolitical competition from a very traditional perspective, where countries want to invest in island countries in the Indian Ocean region in the name of protecting infrastructure, or in the name of climate adaptation, for instance, but they are also violating environmental regulations in these countries, and they can be highly environmentally damaging as well. There is infrastructure risks. You have many bases, military bases. There are many critical infrastructure projects which are highly vulnerable to different effects of climate change as well. And of course, a humanitarian crisis that I spoke about. The broader kind of picture, if you look at, geopolitics beyond these territories and look at the rare earth metals, where is the production happening, who's dominating this. I think these are the discussions which is kind of dominating as well how we perceive decarbonization and energy transitions overall. And China's dominance in this sector is something that is perhaps one of the biggest discussion points, which is why if you look at Quad security dialogue, which involves India, Japan, US, Australia, they're talking about diversifying supply chains and mineral value chains in order to reduce dependence on China for rare earth metals. And the other, big point of discussion, which is also kind of coming up more and more, is about China's investments in, in land and food and agricultural lands across the world, which is also growing day by day. And this has also to do with the growing food demand within China as well. So, I mean, what does it mean for China to have, access to all these lands across the world? Something that, obviously is not new. This has been done during the colonial times and post-colonial times as well. And now you have, a kind of a different way of, looking at these issues, where you have new players who are also kind of becoming part of this quest for newer, influence in newer lands and oceans, for that matter. So I'll end there, and thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Dhanasree. Extremely rich again presentation, and really fascinating examples and stories. I'm very glad that you brought in the regional context and made really visible the real geopolitics, the real environmental geopolitics, and how these shape up in different parts of the world. And also reminding us that, of course, Anthropocene insecurities are everywhere, even if attention right now is put in some particular place. Thank you very much. And I give it now to Marie-Claire.
Great, thank you. And I will just share my screen. How's that?
That's perfect.
Great, okay. So I'm going to move on from Dhanasree's last point about critical minerals, perhaps, and talk specifically about geopolitics and energy. And also maybe shift our unit of analysis around a bit from beyond just the nation state or the military to talk about some of the new actors that are coming up as we get into the energy transition and we look at how things are changing in terms of relationships between countries. So if we look at sort of in Western economically developed countries, in relatively modern times, there's a lot of caveats here, energy has tended to be centrally controlled and managed. So we often have centralized grids. We have nation states, sometimes levels subnationally, making decisions about energy, making decisions about gas pipelines or buying oil or interconnectors for electricity. And what we're seeing now as a result of this very globalized system and highly fossil fuel dependent system is that we're all vulnerable when we see geopolitical turmoil and there is energy involved. So, so for example, in the UK, where I am right now, we only get 4% of our gas from Russia. But because we're part of an international energy market, because we buy energy from the continent, from the European continent, it means that energy prices here have doubled, tripled, are expected to go up even more. And we have things going on like the bosses of energy companies going before Parliament to talk about how come winter, 40% of the population of the UK might be in energy poverty, which is crazy, but also a function of the world that we are currently in. And so what we're seeing is that for the first time in quite a long time, since probably the 70s, we're being asked as individuals, as cities, as local governments, as businesses, to personally take responsibility for the geopolitics of energy. And an example of this is that the International Energy Agency last month put out this 10-point plan to cut oil use, which was quite surprising to a lot of us who work on energy, because it's really focused on reducing demand, which is not something that the IEA often talks about. They generally tend to be focused on selling more energy, but they were talking about things like reducing speed limits on highways, using more public transportation, car-free Sundays, working from home where possible, restricting private car usage, using car sharing, more efficient designs of delivery vehicles, adoption of electric vehicles, avoiding business travel, and switching from planes to trains. So here we go. So this is a very different situation than we're used to seeing in the world of energy. And it means that we're essentially seeing geopolitical pressures align now with climate pressures to focus on this switch to renewable energy supplies and reducing demand. I mentioned that the International Energy Agency often doesn't talk about reducing demand. We don't see a lot of focus on reducing demand in the IPCC scenarios. It's only just coming up because we have, I think, Simon, I wrote it down, asserting a particular mode of life as geopolitics. So we do have a system that is set up to maintain relationships and material flows, to make sure that we have economic growth, to make sure that we are essentially using more energy. And so it's quite significant now that we're seeing this push to use less energy. But the one bit of this IEA plan was about the adoption of electric vehicles, which is on the supply side. And so with energy transitions, when we talk about geopolitics, we talk about the future of energy being essentially fundamentally different. And that's because in a world where we rely more on renewables, we're not relying on restricted sources. So you can't control the wind or the sun the same way that you can control an oil well or a field. Their renewable sources are inherently more decentralized, and usually for those who work in commons work, non-excludable. So this means that energy independence, not just for nation states, but for subnational levels, for cities, for households, is much more possible. So not having to depend on external entities to get the energy that you need. It's much more complicated because it obviously is, and everything always is. This renewable energy transition means that we shift our dependencies around. And so while we may not be relying as much on oil producing or fossil fuel producing or controlling countries, we are looking at a world, as Dhanasree alluded to, where we are really reliant on minerals and materials that are used for renewable energy infrastructure. So things like solar panels, things like wind turbines require minerals, and there are countries that have those minerals who could potentially see their geopolitical positions change. So definitely China, Russia as well, the Congo, lots of places. Of course, whether they're able to benefit geopolitically depends a lot on how those minerals are extracted, whether there are royalty agreements, whether there are multinational companies in there who are extracting profits, and whether the country will actually benefit from that. But there is the potential for a switch in geopolitical relationships. And if we take it one step further, this is driving a whole other cycle of innovation, essentially, in terms of recycling these materials in terms of designing products so that they're not disposable. You don't just throw away solar panels at the end, but you're able to break them apart and recycle them, which again is a change in, as Simon said, a particular mode of life, because we have really been focused on facilitating the use of more energy up to this time. And so this sort of switch has really strong implications for global markets around energy and materials. The other geopolitical consequence, or one of the other ones, is that there are some technologies which have the potential to privilege some countries, depending on the extent to which they're taken up. So a good example is hydrogen, and we're seeing countries like Chile positioning themselves to be able to make a lot of hydrogen. So hydrogen's not a source, it's just a carrier for energy. It's not a particularly efficient one. You need a lot of energy to make a small amount of hydrogen, but it is a really useful one because it's quite dense. So if you're a country that has a lot of wind or easy access to renewables, it may be that by taking advantage of that, you'll be able to position yourself as a supplier of hydrogen. So we already are seeing some of this reshaping of geopolitical relationships, and that's likely to continue. There's another bit to the energy transition which moves our unit analysis down from the nation state, which is sort of what we traditionally talk about when we talk about geopolitics. But within countries, we're seeing that the switch to renewables is fundamentally disruptive. And that's because it changes who can control energy assets. So we're used to, at least in more developed centralized energy systems, we're used to centralized energy assets that are controlled. We don't have to think about it too much, we just turn on the lights. But what we're seeing now is that if you're somebody who has enough money, who has the resources, who has the capacities to buy and install generation infrastructure, you have the potential to take care of your own energy needs. And this definitely is something that's available to those more privileged, but it's a possibility where it wasn't before when we had more centralized or fossil fuel-based resources. And so this creates both opportunities and challenges. And if you've ever seen me do a talk about energy transitions before, you've likely heard me refer to these scenarios that Shell did in 2013, where they modeled a world where we would have lots of decentralized energy, where there would be lots of political turmoil and unrest, and it would be a very unstable world. And they weren't wrong. That is somewhat the world that we're seeing. And it means that you can have many new actors. It means that there's the potential to distribute who profits or who benefits from energy ownership. And that's something that people who study, for example, energy democracy view quite favorably and as an opportunity. It's something that international oil companies perhaps view a bit less favorably because they have quite a lot of influence and control and are quite strong geopolitical players and have used that influence for lots of things. But including weakening carbon targets at the EU level and other things like that. And there is a strong role for states in this in terms of facilitating how these transitions go. So for example, in the Netherlands, you see that they're requiring cities to work with utilities to come up with plans for energy to make sure that the grid's not overwhelmed. And you see it a bit more ad hoc in other places. So following the wildfires in California, there were a lot of conversations about communities investing in their own sort of microgrids where they could disconnect from the grid so they wouldn't be vulnerable to climate change induced disruption to wider electricity grids. So there are different ways that this can be facilitated and the turmoil can be managed. And then, as was alluded to as well, I think by Simon and Dhanasree, is that there are knock-on effects to an energy transition where we do focus on on less demand on renewables, and that's essentially related to the fact that national economies and geopolitical relationships are really built on these highly energy-intensive material flows of things like consumer goods, of food supplies, and then we have economies that revolve around things like aviation-based tourism. So if we're not flying as much, there are a lot of places that will see their economies suffer. And I mean, this is just a short list, but really what we're looking at and what the IPCC report is now talking about, and what the sort of the thermodynamics of renewables implies, is that we're going to have to be using less energy. We're going to have to be demanding less in order to meet climate targets and to make sure that people have access to what they need. So to conclude, what we're seeing, we're currently seeing a lot of turbulence because of the situation with Russia and the Ukraine. But that turbulence, hopefully things get much less violent. But in terms of turbulence in a general sense, it's not likely to end until the energy transition ends. And another thing that's, I suppose, different or new is that this is much less a battle between nation states, or a battle. This is much less about nation states. It's now very much a product of what the city level is doing, what local citizens are doing, what local businesses are doing, because the energy decisions and actions that we are making impact what the national level is doing in terms of negotiating energy relationships. So people are no longer just consumers of energy, and decisions can't just be made above. It needs to be much more integrated, which is a fascinating governance challenge. Yeah, and as I mentioned, this is viewed both as an opportunity by people who would like to see a world where this transition is used to address some of the existing injustices, to address some of the inequality that's there in terms of who materially benefits from energy ownership, but also a threat to the way things operate and the way we have structured social and economic relationships. Yeah, and I think I will leave it there. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Marie-Claire. Another fascinating talk, and you brought another dimension to the discussion. So you moved it away from the nation state to other types of actors, which is fantastic. And yeah, I really liked what you presented at the end, that this turbulence is really unlikely to end until the energy transition ends. And in a way, it also resonates with some of the other speakers, and also Dhanasree speaking about the role of China, etc., and the changing global order. So I think it's there are many open questions on that. So thank you very much for providing these thoughts and very multifaceted aspects on this topic. I would like to invite our audience to post their questions on the chat, and I will pick questions and then post them to our speakers. But just to start off the conversation, I have some questions myself, so I have the privilege as the chair to ask the first questions. And so picking up from some of your talks, but also some things that are very prevalent on the news and the political discussion right now. So some analysts see what's happening right now as an opportunity to move towards, to accelerate the energy transition towards more sustainable sources of energy and moving away from the dependence on fossil fuels. But the reality is that many countries go back to fossil fuels, right? So they go back to coal, or they make plans about how to decrease the dependency on Russia, for instance, in this particular case, but import from other countries. And so politicians try to present this as a short-term solution that they do not really deviate from climate goals, but it's something that is only going to happen until the situation becomes better and we have alternatives. But others fear that really this shows that if there is really no plan for the future that is really is reliable, it's actually a pushback in a way. So how do you see this? Do you see a situation where we're moving, or do you see signs for hope in accelerating the energy transition in a desirable situation, more sustainable or not? I can start with the order of presentation, if you like. So Simon, do you have any thoughts on that?
A few. The crucial point is that if one is switching sources of energy, importing coal or oil from somewhere else, that might be a short-term solution. What worries me, particularly in the European situation, is the discussions of building things like liquid natural gas importation facilities. Because once you start building that kind of infrastructure, they're not cheap. And the demand to get a return on those investments adds additional impetus to continue using those fuels. And I think that this, we need to make a distinction between switching fuel supplies briefly, to your point, Agni, and the difference between that and building new infrastructure which locks in further fossil fuel use is the distinction that's really crucial to make. So emergency switching sources is one thing. Building new infrastructure to facilitate that in an ongoing way gives you a very different consequence. So the politics has to focus on preventing further major fossil fuel infrastructure construction. And that seems to me to be the crux of the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see also many countries pushing their own national interest in this particular circumstances, I believe. Dhanasree, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, I think one of those countries which are pushing the national interest forward is India, which plans to buy more oil from Russia because it's being given cheaper. So definitely this switch, I mean, of course, this is a short-term measure, something that is being done right now because there is an ongoing sort of economic crisis in the neighboring Sri Lanka and Pakistan, and inflation is at an all-time high, even in India. So there is that thought that, oh, this is the right time to maybe buy as much oil as possible and try and mitigate the risks associated with the economic crisis in the neighboring countries and also the, whatever is happening within the country. Just looking at the coal sector alone, for long, India was importing coal from other countries like Australia, Indonesia. And then India wanted to double coal production within the country. That did not happen because there are a lot of movements, environmental movements and indigenous movements against these coal blocks within India as well. And there are a lot of regulations which are preventing that. Of course, economics also plays into these. But I think it's very important to also think of transitions in terms of just transition, because there are a lot of communities that are dependent on these the coal sector. There are many places which are dependent on the revenues that are generated from coal. So it's also important to discuss, in terms of the transitions, how do we transition in a way that is, of course, just and equitable, and also looking at gender aspects, and all these different aspects need to be brought into the discussion. More importantly, I think what is important to discuss is, beyond the long-term sort of benefits of climate action, how does even the short-term kind of actions, how does it help public health? How does it help other sectors as well, instead of just looking at it in terms of emissions reduction? I think the conversations sort of need to shift in the direction of looking at it from a holistic perspective that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not about a particular facet of the problem. The problem is really diverse, and all the different dimensions are related. Marie-Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I can build on that because what we are seeing in a lot of countries is that there is a natural tendency to focus on the supply side, and that's because we're viewed as consumers, that governments are used to managing energy systems as outward flows. And so this conversation about reducing demand as the other side of the coin to supply, I mean, it's starting to happen, but it depends where you are. And for example, in the UK, the strategies have been almost exclusively focused on the supply side. So it's really a shift in logic, in the driving logic for the energy system to look at how can we reduce demand and how can we support people in reducing demand, because that's the one thing. I mean, it takes time to shift supplies. It takes time to build more wind. Even if it's fossil fuels, it takes time to bring those back online if they've been taken off. But you can immediately start reducing energy demand by doing things like insulating homes, by shifting modes of transit, things that often people are already on board with because they know that it will increase their quality of life. It will reduce their personal household expenditures on energy during a crazy economic time. But it's really tricky to get governments to pay for those sorts of things. So that's sort of the immediate. But what's happening now, and you said something, Agni, about viewing the future as not as reliable. Energy is not as reliable, which I think is also something that is worth thinking about, because it's a conversation in the energy sector where when you start thinking about what does the world look like in the future, where we have renewables and we've completely phased out fossil fuels, what do we become used to living with? Are we okay with occasional power outages? Are we okay with doing things differently? Which is a larger conversation about how we live differently, about the logics that drive society, and about what we value.
Yes, and I mean, we see this in the Dutch context where I'm situated. So the government, for instance, had decided to turn the thermostat lower, so to 19 degrees instead of 21 degrees. And the University of Utrecht, where I'm based, is currently also discussing whether they want to implement this kind of measure and encouraging the public. But these are unprecedented kind of measures. And of course, they can't just be that, right? As you said, there must be support for people to make these changes as well, insulating their homes, for instance, stuff like that. I see some questions coming from the audience, so I will collect some questions and then I can ask you more. I mean, that's a very rich topic. But one question comes from Theodor Kalpakchiev. Apologies if I mispronounce your name. It's directed at Marie-Claire, and the question is, if one aims for resource autonomy, why would one need geopolitical relationships? These are all related to primary resources. I can take a couple of more questions if you don't mind and give you the floor. Then we have a question from Eduardo Gallo Cajiao, which is not addressed to someone in particular. So how is the current Russian invasion of Ukraine going to play out in the context of the transition to renewables? And I will take one more from Natalie Ralph. Can we have a stronger crossover between geopolitics research and research addressing on the ground work in, for example, eco-villages where people are grouping together to reduce their energy and resource use, increase local food production, use cars less, etc.? So I'm going to start with Marie-Claire in this case.
Yeah, well, on why countries would need geopolitical relationships, you do need to get material resources from somewhere, even if you find super efficient ways to recycle them. You do need, if you're expanding production, you're going to need them. Maybe eventually we'll get to a state where we can just keep reusing what we have in circulation, but for the foreseeable future, you'll need those relationships. But there's also, I mean, geopolitics is more than just material flows. It's also knowledge. It's also technological systems. Increasingly, it's about like IT and technical capacity as well. So yeah, I don't think you could isolate yourself from that one. Maybe, yeah, I'll stop there and let the others respond.
Thanks. Dhanasree?
Okay, I'll probably answer the question about, the crossover between geopolitics research and research addressing on the groundwork. And I think it's already happening in many places, even, in conflict zones and, where there is a lot more emphasis being laid on what is happening on the ground and how are people being affected, or how are people not just being affected, but also contributing as stakeholders and actors and with agency in how Earth system governance works. I think even if you talk about the Hindu Kush Himalaya region as an example, there is a lot of, there are a lot of eco villages in the region which don't get emphasized. Unfortunately, they don't come out in the open as to what's happening there in terms of transitions. And there are villages which have been declared as the cleanest villages in the world, or in terms of energy efficiency, or in terms of using renewable energy, and so on and so forth. But I think the problem comes when, for instance, in the northeastern part of India, which is also bordering China, when China builds like a lot of dams on its side, the Indian government is also like trying to build its own dams on this part of the border, without really taking into consideration what do the people on the ground really want. Do they want these dams? Is it really contributing to their development? No, these are largely, these kind of geopolitical decisions based on so-called national security discourses that if China is building them, we also need to build them, and India needs to protect its interests, and so on and so forth. So very often these the subnational or the local geopolitical realities don't get reflected in these discourses, because the policies tend to be made somewhere else. They are not being made, where the people are being affected. So there is, of course, that kind of conflict between different levels of policy making and governance, which tends to make things much more complex and sometimes much worse than what it was before. Sometimes, as I mentioned, much more damaging to the environment than before. So these are concerns which obviously would have to also get reflected in the geopolitical discussions.
Great, thank you. Simon?
I'd just like to emphasize one of the points that Marie-Claire made, which she made a couple of times by now, and that is that fossil fuels are based on fuel. Most of the renewables are not. And there's a profoundly different consequences for the Earth system, but also profoundly different consequences for those geopolitical relationships, because minerals come from different places than coal and oil and gas do, and so they're very different geographies. And I think it's really important to emphasize that point. Marie-Claire made it clearly, and I think we need to stop and think long and hard about that. To the point about conservation and the reduction of the use of fuels actually improving our domestic finances, I mean, this too is a long-standing argument. And if I'm being a historian, which seems to be my role today, 5 years after the Stockholm Conference, Amory Lovins published that little book called Soft Energy Paths, where the contrast is dramatically laid out. This in the context of geopolitical disruptions from the fallout from the OPEC partial boycott and rapid increase in oil prices in response to the October war in the Middle East. So once again, Amory Lovins is incredibly prescient. And if people who are listening have not read his 1977 book on soft energy paths, while all the pricing and the numbers are different in terms of the energy prices that he based his calculations on, obviously. Nonetheless, the basic logic of getting our societies collectively off fossil fuels is all laid out there. And in many ways, he's still at it, he's still publishing, but the 1977 book is a historical moment that is so important for our ongoing discussion. If you don't know it, you do now.
Great, thanks for your answer. Marie-Claire, you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm just aware that we didn't address the question on the Ukraine and coal. And I just wanted to, because I think what we're seeing, we have a project on coal transitions in the EU, and what we're seeing is because of EU regulations within the EU, we're not seeing this huge expansion of coal that you're seeing in other places. But I do think without that legislation, that you are seeing expanded coal production, and I think that will probably have quite a negative impact on climate efforts. And one more piece on research between geopolitics and what's happening on the ground. There's definitely some space for the ESG community here, because some of this is researched in the sustainability transitions community, but in terms of governance and linking different levels of governance together, there's a huge space where there is work to be done on how to govern those sorts of processes and examine how they're being governed.
Yeah, perfect. And that gives me actually a bridge to just say a few things about their system governance, where we have a various task forces where we discuss these kind of questions and bring together a really international group of scholars. Gustav can tell more about it after the session. But we were thinking we missed a geopolitics task force, so people who are really dedicated to discuss this kind of questions. And if you're interested, these are very bottom-up initiatives. You can bring this to Gustav's attention later. And I would like to ask, so Simon, that there are a couple of more questions. I will bring them up to the discussion as well. But picking up from a point that Simon emphasized, that Marie-Claire made, and I think also Dhanasree alluded to, with the emergence of China as a very important actor in terms, buying land in different places of the world, and we know that food security is going to be a huge issue as well. So do you see what's happening as also part of the emergence of a new global order in a way? So do we see, like, to be dramatic, the death of all superpowers and the rise of new ones and new kind of relations, and we know from history that this kind of changes are very violent most of the time. So do you connect what's happening with a changing world order and what's that going to mean for sustainability? It's hopefully good things will emerge, but how do you see the situation? So maybe I'll start now from Dhanasree, if my question makes any sense at all, Dhanasree.
No, yeah, I mean, I raised the issue of the changing world order, when you have new players who are dominating the scene, like China, which was not the case even a couple of decades ago. I mean, there are pros and cons to it. There are new players, there are, which also means, like Marie-Claire mentioned about decentralization, it also leads to kind of, empowering newer actors, which may not be nation states, but other players at the subnational level. The way the climate governance regimes are also evolving, you can see clearly that the power is equally kind of shifting to other players in the scene. It's not restricted to the government alone. You have cities now which are forging partnerships between each other, like, the cities of two different countries. Something that is not necessarily kind of related to how the governments may be operating, in a very different, the federal governments may be operating in a very different realm. There's also people-to-people contacts and transnational networks which are operating, of researchers, of non-governmental organizations and other players who are also becoming very important players. I think this is also to do with the failure of nation states to really provide solutions to sustainability, which has led to these other players becoming more important in the space of sustainability. But of course, there are some problems with the emergence of new players, like, I mean, China, for instance, what kind of intentions does it have? Say, like, I mean, recently with its security partnership with Solomon Islands, for instance, what does it mean for the Pacific Islands? If a new base is, say, going to be built in the Pacific, which was known to be a nuclear weapon free zone, and militarily not very active for a long time, which was was a zone of nuclear weapon tests for a long time used by the developed countries. So in that sense, what does it mean for when you have newer players who want to assert themselves, expand their influence, who still see territory in terms of that strategic sort of depth, or something that is looked at from a very that sort of perspective? That also needs to be discussed, but I don't see multilateralism or multi-polar kind of politics really affecting sustainability, because I think, as I mentioned, the shifting power centers is something that will obviously aid sustainability transitions in a much better way as compared to what it was in a very neoliberal sort of economic order, which I don't think has provided the solutions to all the problems that we have.
Great, thank you very much. Marie-Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think we essentially have two choices. We could have a new global order with replacement megapowers, and I mean that's possible, I think, in the short term. But if it's based on this extractive, consumptive model, I mean, we're going to self-destruct. We're so close to all planetary boundaries that are not just climate, but in terms of nutrients, in terms of like pesticides and pollution and all sorts of things, that we just can't continue this way. And so unless we're creating something new, which is emerging, as Dhanasree says, then I think that's I mean, yeah, it's two options. It's one or the other. We survive or we don't.
Very, very serious moment, but also I'm gonna ask it later, like how are we gonna decide? But I'm gonna put it off for now and give the floor to Simon if he has any reflections on this.
To Marie-Claire's point, I think that one of the points you made, Agni, in terms of new orders necessarily being violent, one of the reasons I like to use that image of the Berlin Wall is that there was a dramatic geopolitical change that was relatively non-violent on that particular moment. And I think it does open up the prospect of changing geopolitics quite dramatically, but not necessarily involving us in huge wars. One of the ironies of the fall of the Berlin Wall was, of course, that in the West, and again, this is Jarvis Grove's notion about geopolitics as asserting modes of life, particularly in the United States, it was seen as a victory. It was the triumph of capitalism. It was the triumph of freedom. We all know the rest of those ideological arguments. What got lost in all of this was the new thinking in the Soviet Union in particular, which was arguing that the whole nuclear confrontation was simply too difficult a prospect going forward to continue with. It was likely to end disastrously, and the necessity of new thinking was related firstly to the abandonment of the basic Leninist assumption that capitalism was inevitably war-prone. And hence the assumption was that it was possible to manage international relations peacefully, not relying on nuclear strategy. Part of that was also the emergence of the notion of ecological security in Soviet thinking. Following on from Chernobyl in particular, and being pushed by the environmental protest movements in Eastern Europe, and opposition to the Soviet model was being powerfully pushed by environmental movements in the late 1980s. They began to reconsider security more fundamentally along ecological lines. And that all got swept aside when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Western mode of life was seen as the one that the whole world should adopt based on fossil fuels, unfortunately. And that whole idea about rethinking security, thinking about ecology in much more fundamental terms got swept aside. And it really is important to stop and think about the links there between environment and geopolitical transition, hopefully from all of that, we can learn that it might be possible to build that new order, the sustainable one that Marie-Claire and Dhanasree are both advocating for, and I am, of course, too, and do so peacefully. But this is why transition discussions are absolutely crucial part of the Earth system governance discussion. How do we get there with mollifying the worst disruptions that are likely to lead to conflict? And I think that that's really a crucial part of the Earth system governance discussion now, has to be how to get there from here and do so in building a new world order that is not based on fossil fuels, but will have different geopolitical connections. And how we transition those things, I think, is absolutely crucial. This is a key part of what we all need to be working on in coming years.
I absolutely agree, and I take the opportunity to actually ask the last two questions in combination. So how do we get there? How do we change? And of course, that's not something, you know, that it falls on your shoulders only. Of course, it's something a collective, we should do collectively, and not only within the research community, of course, but transdisciplinary, in a transdisciplinary way. But there is one question from the audience. Do we need if I interpret it correctly, do we need international cooperation? And what about moving, you know, to more regional forms of cooperation? Maybe that's a solution. What kind of capacities, imaginations, and perspectives do we need to change? And I suppose as citizens, as researchers, as I don't know, as state politicians, to really change, to get, because as Marie-Claire said, it's not automatic that if we just move away from fossil fuels to more renewable source of energy, that we will have a necessarily different world order, because like the necessary materials to build the technologies that support these renewable energy transitions may lead to different kind of dependencies, and we may just shift the problem. So how do we do that then? I start from Marie-Claire because I see.
Great. Okay, an easy one. I think, so just what kind of capacities do we need? And I think the answer is persistence. And there's a big debate over individual versus structural change. And if I do something small, does it make a difference? And the answer is always we need both. We need people making small changes, but we need really big political structural changes. And we do, for those of us living in supposed democracies, we do have the capacity to be pushing and taking action, but it is persistence, because we are materially, systemically, structurally, institutionally locked in to a way of thinking, of consuming, of going about our lives, of doing things, and there's always a tendency to slide back. So governments, it's easy to turn to, oh well, we'll just fire up the gas-fired power plants again to maintain this way of life that we have. And so it takes a constant push, and it's exhausting, and you need to take breaks and take care of yourself and all those things. But this is a long-term, sustained, collective effort. So working together across all levels, which is a big ask of people, but it's what we have to do in order to get there. And I don't want to neglect the question on, do we need international cooperation? Yes, because if one country saves itself and the rest self-destruct, it's a global commons, like we all self-destruct together.
Thank you. Simon?
Yes, we do need international cooperation, and I think the webinar that we are all participating in is exactly the kind of international cooperation that we need to promote, so well done on that. I think the cooperation is also a matter of collectively learning what works where and how do you move it to other locations. That kind of cooperation, the shared learning and the best practices, I think, are crucial. But to Marie-Claire's point, we also need to think carefully as academics about how we transform the disciplinary context in which we're actually working, whether it's geography, political science, or whatever. we need to think about how do the discipline we are working in address the transition questions. And I think that's something that is also has to be part of our professional practice as well as our personal lives. And final point is the imagination point. We need to think about living better for the future. And ironically, the person who's given us the perfect slogan is none other than Ronald Reagan, who before he was a politician was a pitchman for various electric consumer goods corporations with the slogan, live better electrically.
Fantastic. So, Dhanasree, what is your point?
Yeah, I'm just going to second both Marie-Claire and Simon, all the points that they mentioned. Just to add on maybe to the part on the regional cooperation, and I according to me, that's very important. Something that I think we haven't really invested much into regional cooperation, especially regions that share ecological systems, like the Hindu Kush Himalaya region is one. I mean, you have even subsystems like the Sundarbans that's shared by India and Bangladesh, or you have Indus Basin, which is shared between various countries in the South Asian region, or the Brahmaputra River Basin. Now, these are basins that, you know, individual countries or communities cannot really govern them, or can just make sure that everything is fine with the systems in place. So it's important that countries come together, of course, at a very, you know, at a regional level as well, when we talk about ecological or socio-ecological systems that are restricted to, say, a particular area. However, unfortunately, most of the regional organizations, especially in this region of South Asia, Southeast Asia, they don't invest much in environmental issues or ecological issues. They're kind of constrained when it comes to resources and technology and capacity building and training. So this is where, as Simon also mentioned, there's a lot to learn from each other. There's a lot, you know, pooling of resources, or, you know, just the fact that you need to just create awareness around these issues in most of these places, which is itself is lacking. So I think that regional initiatives need to be strengthened further, which can obviously complement. It need not be something that that dilutes international cooperation, but something that can complement international cooperation is very important. Another area where, you know, mobility patterns, mostly they are very regional in nature. I think, you know, countries need to be need to have some systems in place. I mean, you know, migration itself is not a problem, but if you don't have systems in place to deal with migration, then obviously, you know, you are dealing with a much bigger problem. So I think as people move just to adapt to climate change, or moving away from vulnerable regions, usually to the neighboring countries, most of the time you need to find out ways to deal with these issues in a much better way. Again, we are lacking when it comes to these kind of changes that we are seeing across the world. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And this brings us to the end. It was fascinating to have all three of you. Thank you for sharing your experiences, your thoughts, and having this discussion. And I hope that it's the beginning of a discussion, and that we're going to continue this in multiple fora. And especially in the Toronto conference that's upcoming, I hope that we are able to meet in person again. So thank you very much. I hand it over to Gustav for the final details.
All right. Thank you very much, Agni, and thank you, Dhanasree, Simon, Marie-Claire, for coming here and accepting our invitation to speak on this very timely and important issue. And I do hope as well that we can continue talking about these, talking about geopolitics, talking about sustainability transitions this year and for the coming future. I do now want to just say, I do want to just wrap up, but also invite anyone who wants to stay in the chat a bit. We will, for those who wish to stay, we will make them able to connect with audio and video and have a bit of a conversation afterwards. We're not going to run more than 20 minutes. This invitation also extends to our speakers, but we do understand if you also have other commitments, of course. So with this said, I think we will start to invite the people that stay now into the room, and maybe this can be a way to keep continuing the conversation. And likewise, if you do have any questions about how